Sometimes down the lane we will start thinking that what are we exactly doing, why are we doing it, and how are we going to give it back to the generation. Now 20-30 years back in India, we were talking about a very interesting topic called as population explosion. Now when you start depleting the land resources, we do not take the time to again go back and create those land resources. Welcome to the first session in Chapter 3, Unit 2, Sustainable Development B.C.A, where we are going to talk about optimal use of renewable resources. Now, the moment the word renewable resources comes into picture, the essential feature is that this stock is not fixed. That is the biggest challenge. That means it cannot be increased naturally as and when you want. It is not something man-made, and it is not something that you can just do it out of an app or do it just out of a push of a button. So what happens here is that if that stock of that material starts to deplete, it starts going on at a great rate, and it becomes very difficult for each one of us to restore it back. So that's why I would say that the most difficult factor of the renewable resource is to get it back into action. Then the next thing is that when you look into the examples of this, starting from fishery, forest, marine resources, water, all this point have got a threshold limit. Now I want to spend a couple of minutes here trying to talk about this threshold limit. Now we say that for everything in this world, there is a limit, there is a holding pattern, there is a stagnation level that you have to understand. Why? Because if you're going to cross that limit, if you're going to go beyond that limit, then that particular resource will definitely start depleting. So it becomes mandatory for all of us to understand here that we need to somehow hold this stock back. We need to see that there is a judicial use of the stock which is being done so that we are able to generate the best quality resource altogether. Followed by, this is further decided by carrying capacity of the ecosystem in which we exist. So whenever we talk about the ecosystem, that is our planet Earth, now we have a capacity, we have a modulation, we have a defined geographical limits for it. So once we are going to cross it, it's not going to be possible at all. So within the ecosystem, whatever is the possible limit, to whatever extent it can exist, that we need to look into it so that we are able to make an optimal utilization of the resources. Followed by, the potential for the increase is important because we can harvest the incremental stock, and provided certain conditions are met, the harvesting of incremental stock and its growth can go on for successive time points. Now let's try to understand this factor. For the coming generation, are we going to leave the reserves of oil and petroleum? Now that's a very big question mark that comes into the mind of you. Why? Because sometimes when you go back, look at yourself, are we going to just deplete that fossil and the future generation is going to look only at electric? That's where this incremental stock factor comes into picture. Why? Because sometimes down the lane we will start thinking that what are we exactly doing? Why are we doing it? And how are we going to give it back to the generation? We just believe that the Mother Nature has given everything for us to enjoy, everything for us to put it in use. But then we don't think in the same lines of giving it back. So that leads to the depletion of stock at a greater rate rather than the incremental of the same stock value. So at one point of time, what happens is that the ecosystem will get adversely affected, and the future generation would have to face the brunt of depleting the natural resources. So that's why I always say that you cannot carry on the resource for a very long time and then ask the ecosystem to regenerate or come back to its normal form. It is our primary duty that we go forward, we take an initiative of restoring, replenishing all those stocks back into action so that we are able to give our generations a better livelihood. Now, The next thing is that in case of biological resources, the size of the resource stock population is determined jointly by biological factors and the human interference, no doubt about it. The size of population in turn determines the availability of resources in future. Now, 20, 30 years back in India, we were talking about a very interesting topic called as population explosion. Now, people said that by 2000, if you don't control the population explosion in India, it's going to be a very big problem. But we did not pay attention to it. Why? Because on one side, we were concerned only about our developmental sectors. We were talking about the IT industry, the services sector, and a whole lot of growth factors that was actually determining India's path to success. Over a period of time, today when we look back in the year 2022 as we are talking, we have a population roughly equal to about 135 crores to 137 crores, which is looking around at us. Now, when we talk about a population of that size of, when I'm talking about a 1.3 billion population altogether. Now, the question that starts coming into your mind is that, will our country able to continue to take the load of population? Why? Because as the population keeps increasing day by day, the resources will also start getting depleted, and we don't have a way that we can automatically restore it back. So at one point of time, what is happening here is that the usage of resources is also directly proportional to the active population that is available there. So if your population keeps on increasing beyond a given point, the resources will also get depleted within a short period of time. So this is where I would say that over and over again, we are talking about this word called as efficiency. Somewhere down the lane, we have to become more efficient, more stringent in terms of making the utilization of the resources, and also drive back with the best capacity forward so that we are able to get our nature under a balanced mode. Followed by a related question is that, can the market be relied upon to achieve and sustain this rate? Now, this is again an introductory question which we still have in our mind. Why? Because in this unit we are actually trying to focus on this factor called as sustainability with growth. That's what we are trying to talk in the environmental economics, and we are also trying to talk about the factor called as how the optimal utilization of the resources can be done so that we are able to sustain the growth for a longer time period. Over a last few years, if you would have been observing, what has become the most challenging factor is that the dependency of human factor on the environmental system. So now what is happening is that when we talk about the human factor on environment, we have largely gone to the extent of destroying the environment and making the maximum use of resources, starting from the forest or from the marine, from the agriculture, from every single sector. What we have tried to do is that because we want to expand, we want to grow, we want to have better occupational space, so we have been making use of the environment. We have been cutting down trees, we have been cutting down on so many natural resources for our existence. Now, the question that is now sharply looking at for us is that, can you sustain at this rate? Sustainability immediately starts asking us question, if you keep on cutting down the forest, if you keep on shutting down those lakes, or if you just forget the ecosystem balance, if you just forget the factor that you are not able to produce more, the climatic changes coming into picture, and all of us know about the factor that what is the impact of the weather that is going to happen in terms of agriculture and production, will our sustainability be lasting long enough? So that's where the focus of the entire chapter lies here. So we are going to address this particular question repeatedly so that we are able to achieve a solution here. Now, the word called as dynamic optimization. Why is that word dynamic optimization coming into picture? All natural systems are dynamic in sense. That means they can change over a time and they are also able to sustain despite the shocks. One important factor of dynamic system is whether the variables within the system converge to a fixed point called a steady state. Now, for example, let us take water itself. One side, when we are depleting the water, the other side, because of the rainfall or because of a sudden climatic changes, flash floods and everything, again we see that water balance somewhere comes back. But then what is more important here is that when I talk about the word called as dynamic optimization, it is a point at which you are able to restore back or get the balance in nature. Now, this is not applicable for all the resources in the environment. This is probably applicable to those kind of assets which are able to come back to the steady state point at a given frequency, at a given wavelength altogether. Now, what happens here is that many assets do not tend to come back so soon. Now, when you start depleting the land resources, we do not take the time to again go back and create those land resources. What we tend to do is that we tend to occupy all the open spaces wherever they are available and the urbanization begins. Now, once the urbanization begins, starting from the land, air, water, the environment, forestry, everything starts depleting. Why? Because you go on an expansion mode. You don't go on a mode of giving it back. So now what happens? The balance does not come in picture and slowly the environment gets deteriorated. But when I talk about this dynamic optimization, there are certain resources where we see that the possibility of driving it back to normalcy is possible. Like solar energy, for example, how much ever we consume, it is still available. So we find that solar energy is able to again give us the maximum in spite of higher utilization that is coming up in the modern lifestyle. So at one point of time, if you are able to achieve that steady state, then we don't have to worry. The resources are there for you and that can take an edge over in terms of growth. Followed by the existence of such steady state mind can reach them on a particular importance of managing the natural resources, which is why I'm trying to talk about this factor called as the fixed point stabilization, where we are very much interested about knowing the initial value of the variable. Now that is very, very important for us. Where does that variable start? What is the value of the variable under which we are talking about? Now, when I talk about this optimal biomass, now this is a very, very important topic for all of us. Discounting has got a very, very important factor in terms of optimal levels of harvest and biomass. The greater the discount rate, the less valuable are the returns in future and the factors in terms of investment. What is this discounting rate? First, let's try to understand. Now, let's say that out of the 100% land, I'm going to just discount off 20%, which means the remaining is only 80% of land. Now, what I'm trying to do is that this 20% I'm discounting. Why? Because of the investment conditions that are coming in there. Now, what is going to be the very important factor is that in future, will we be able to contribute back on this 20%? Will we be able to come back and restore it back to 100%? Or will we continue to depreciate from this 80 only? That's where this discounting factor becomes a very important topic for all of us. Why? Because the depletion of resources has to be restored. But unfortunately, what happens is that we do not even go back to the previous level. We keep on deteriorating from the present level to a further rock bottom level, which you cannot come back at all. So that's why the discounting phenomena can cause a serious impact on the value. So that's why I always say that this is where you need to start focusing. You need to start rebuilding the entire system. Now, let's go to the economics of forestry. Now, this is a very, very interesting topic altogether. Now, people might ask this question, even inside the forest, is there economics? The answer is yes. Why? Because economics is relevant. Economics is prevalent everywhere across. It's available everywhere. It's just like the oxygen that just floats around you. So you are surrounded by economics at any given point of time. Now, coming back to the forestry fact point of view, Forests are the integrated part, no doubt about it, and they are always like, the provider of fuel, foodstuff, and building material. It's a very, very important source of environmental and the amenity services. Now, the forest part is something where I would like to start with the unknown circle altogether. Forest is something which is considered to be the most important natural wealth that has been blessed and that has been given to us. But what happens here is that forestry always remains a mystery to most of us. Why? Because we do not know much about it. We do not understand the output of the forest, and we always considered forest as a living area for the wild animals. That's it. So forest becomes a vacation, forest becomes a sightseeing activity, but forest is never understood as a national economic resource altogether. So what happens here is that the forest is still remaining as an unused resource for many years, and all of a sudden, when man decides to expand his living area, automatically he starts cutting down on trees. So whenever you go to a forest, it is still a mystery for us to understand what does those tall tree do's, or what does those big, oak tree, or for example, sandalwood trees or the silver trees, what are their real purpose? Do they just grow and stand there? Or are we going to make some economic resource out of it? Are we going to use it somewhere? We do not know about it. We only believe that forests are just a standstill resource for us, which is being just gifted to us. It's all about the green cover. No doubts about it. Why? Because forest is the primary source of generating rainfall. Forest is the primary source through which you are going to get the resources for all the genetic materials. And forest, of course, is the dwelling house of those beautiful wild animals that have been created by God. So now what we are trying to understand here is that this resource depletion cannot happen at a random stage, at a rapid stage, which will actually shake off the balance in terms of human beings versus the nature. So the forestry has to be protected, has to be taken care. Then only we will be able to get an integrated economics altogether. Followed by the crucial role that is being played, especially in terms of watersheds, the supply that is being given. Moreover, the forests have a great value in providing amenity services, and therefore, once you start seeing the environmental thing, many problems can be fixed once we understand the importance of forests. Now, for example, when we look into the products, from the simple products to that of the complex products that we have been generated, we have the role from the forest. So the critical role they play in sustaining environment and consumption smoothing, that's going to be a very, very important topic for us. Why? Because forest is able to give us that balancing factor. So once you start shaking out, once you start eroding the forest, the balancing act is going to be depleted. Followed by the forest, beside protecting us, it also gives us renewable resources and also exhibits some unique features that we do not know much about it, but then we tend to understand it over a period of time. Now what happens is that for a commercial value, we cut down the trees and those are being sold in the market. However, if not cut like capital assets, as I told you, standing forests provide a stream of non-timber environmental services. So whenever you go through the forest and whenever you have a look at those nice, tall, beautiful trees, you always feel that they are like those standing giants of asset value, which will create a long-term relationship, which will create a long-term value in terms of the economic balance. But what we tend to do is that we tend to look at them as a commercial value set altogether. We just cut down the trees. We believe that each and every tree has got some value in terms of the commercial market. So just cut it out, sell it, and make the money out of it. So that's where we make a mystery of complete depletion of the forest. Now, most of the environmental benefits which are provided by the forest have a positive externalities. You know that in economics, we have the positive and the negative externalities, which we have been speaking for a very long run, which normally cannot be captured by the resource managers, leading to inefficient management. That's what we have always been speaking about. Hence, the present section of forestry aims at covering how economics can be combined with forest ecology to arrive at an efficient management of this. So this is very, very important for all of us to understand the natural resource core matter. And we are also going to talk about another important thing that's called as an economic approach. This is based on the biological criteria criticized on the ground, and it does not take into account any of the economic value. So we are going to typically talk from the biological criteria. I'm not going to attach any monetary value here. Now, the economic efficiency, now this is a new word of timber management, implies choosing the optimal age of harvesting and at the present value, and what can be the maximum value over a period of time. So even timber, wood, has got some value which has to be realized, which has to be understood over a given period of time, and then it has to be taken from that level to the present level altogether. So in future, what we are trying to decide is that the forest as a unit will have a different asset value, different asset classification altogether. But what is that we have done to realize this value, realize the potential of the forest? So, whenever we talk about the exogenous variables like growth of a tree, output they produce, the discount value, all those things have to be taken into account. That would maximize the present value from harvesting a tree. Why? Because the output value, you need to make people understand the output more stronger than the input. Now, normally when you run a campaign and saying that save trees, save plants and all those things, people don't believe you because people think that that's just a marketing campaign with some social factors included. But then just go back and explain the people the commercial value, the output of the same trees. People will become interested. Why? Because it's not just money. It's also the future asset value that is going to be generated over a period of time. Followed by the investment under uncertainty. Most of the time we know that the important factor under which we are living in economics is the uncertainty, and pretty much after the COVID there's been a lot of uncertainty among people, both in terms of lifestyle and also in terms of the economic factors. Keeping that in mind, much of the early literature on the economics of renewable resources were cast in a decision environment of a perfect certainty. However, both biological parameters and economic parameters are more likely to exhibit the scholastic attitude. They just go ahead and in terms of making you understand how things work, how things are going. So it's very, very dynamic factor under which we are speaking. This is going to be something very, very challenging on a nature basis. So this is going to be something very interesting for us in terms of understanding, in terms of taking it forward. Now, most of the time, whenever we are investing on a resources, we see that the environment was perfect, but we never know how the environment is going to change. So whatever investments that we are making in terms of nature, you need to have that certainty factor, then only the growth is also possible. Now, the investment uncertainty will also talk about the factors like goal of net present value maximization to the steady state condition, which is also characterized by irreversibility so that the nature does not change. In such applications, a framework is also being brought into picture, which is very, very suitable. This framework for the natural source valuation and management has generally emerged from the theories of capital investment, just like how people have been investing in the stock market, people have been investing in gold and the metals and commodities. Similarly, people have also started understanding the importance of investing in organic farming, investing in green culture and other factors, because they also see that there's a lot of flexibility in terms of timing. There's also flexibility in terms of growth. You can take your time and grow with nature altogether. Now, a literature of corporate and public finance, most decisions have also tried to exhibit about this factor. The timing of investments can also be flexible. So we have been working out a lot on this literature, trying to make people understand in different countries and segments how people have been able to see that, how people have been able to see the growth factors over a period of time in terms of the economic value. Now, the other factor that I would like to say is that knowing as an option value, whenever I use this word option value, that is futuristic in nature, investment can push optimal rates of return well above the discount rate. That means to say that over a period of time, you will be able to get better value over the discount, and this can form as a common framework. That means you will be able to get better returns if you are investing in nature today. And when uncertainty is explicitly considered using the stochastic model and everything, we can also look at alternatives to secure your investment, and such optimistic models are available in economics, which can create a better return value to the asset altogether. With this, I come to the conclusion of today's session. I hope and believe that all the resources that are shared through this presentation will be of great value to you, both in terms of theory as well as in the practical walk of life. In the upcoming sessions, we are going to talk about limits to the growth model, which is a very, very interesting topic, and it has got a lot of functionalities towards the environmental economics. But until then, stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me today on this wonderful session.